The researchers' interest in this topic emerged from a broader societal concern that extends well beyond individual student experiences. Across higher education, institutions are reporting rising levels of academic stress among college students. Increased stress has been linked to burnout, disengagement, course withdrawal, delayed degree completion, and reduced well-being. When these outcomes occur at scale, they become institutional and societal issues, affecting graduation rates, workforce preparation, and equity in educational opportunity. At the same time, social media has become a routine part of daily life for most college students. Public discourse and institutional conversations frequently frame social media as a major driver of student stress. This framing often shapes wellness programming, advising practices, and informal policy decisions. The broader so what tension is clear. If institutions overestimate the role of social media, they may invest heavily in interventions that do little to reduce stress. If they underestimate its role, they may ignore a meaningful contributor within a larger stress system. This concern became more concrete through repeated interactions with students who described feeling overwhelmed by academic demands while also reporting high levels of daily social media use. Some students described social media as increasing distraction, comparison, and time pressure. Others described it as a way to relax, connect socially, or cope with academic pressure. These mixed experiences raised an important empirical question. Rather than assuming social media is either harmful or helpful, the field needs clearer evidence about whether social media use and academic stress are actually related and, critically, how strong that relationship is. A review of the existing literature reflects this same uncertainty. Some studies report positive associations between social media use and stress, suggesting that increased use may be linked to distraction, comparison, or cognitive overload. Other studies report weak, inconsistent, or context-dependent relationships, particularly when stress is defined specifically as academic stress rather than general psychological distress. Many discussions imply a relationship without clearly quantifying its magnitude. As a result, the literature lacks sufficient empirical evidence addressing a focused gap. Whether there is a measurable relationship between social media use and academic stress among college students, and how strong that relationship actually is. This study is grounded in a post-positivist worldview, which assumes that patterns in behavior and experience can be measured, that findings are probabilistic rather than absolute, and that statistical analysis can reduce uncertainty, while acknowledging limitations. From this perspective, the goal is not to establish causal truth, but to estimate relationships and evaluate their strength using empirical evidence. The study is guided by a clearly specified theoretical framework, the transactional model of stress and coping, developed by Lazarus and Folkman. This framework conceptualizes stress as the result of how individuals appraise demands and evaluate their available coping resources. Stress does not arise solely from objective demands. It emerges when individuals perceive those demands as exceeding their ability to cope. This framework is particularly appropriate for the present study because social media use can plausibly influence both appraisal and coping processes. Social media may increase perceived demands through time pressure, comparison, or distraction, and it may also function as a coping strategy, whether adaptive or avoidant. Importantly, the framework does not assume that social media causes stress. Instead, it supports the expectation that social media use may be associated with academic stress in ways that vary across individuals. This theoretical positioning directly aligns with a correlational approach. The choice of measurement also reflects this theoretical framework. Academic stress was measured using a scale that captures perceived academic demands and pressure rather than objective workload alone. This aligns with the transactional model's emphasis on appraisal and perceived strain, strengthening conceptual alignment between theory and measurement. Because the research goal is to examine whether two numeric variables are related, the study is inherently quantitative. The study does not seek to explore students' lived experiences in depth, which would require a qualitative approach. It does not attempt to predict stress using multiple variables, which would suggest regression. Instead, it asks a narrower and more precise question. Do students who report higher levels of social media use also tend to report higher levels of academic stress? The study uses a non-experimental, correlational design. This design is necessary because it would not be ethical or practical to assign students to different levels of social media use. Social media behavior occurs naturally and varies across individuals. The study therefore observes naturally occurring variation rather than manipulating exposure. Because no variables are manipulated, causal conclusions are not supported. Participants were undergraduate students recruited from a mid-sized university using convenience sampling. Students were invited to participate through course announcements and campus-wide messages. This sampling strategy was chosen for feasibility and access. While convenience sampling limits generalizability beyond similar student populations, it is appropriate for correlational research, focused on identifying patterns rather than making population-level causal claims. 2 numeric variables were measured for each participant. The first variable was average daily social media use, measured in hours. Social media use was operationally defined as time spent on platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and X. Students reported their average daily use during a typical academic week. This definition and time frame were used to reduce ambiguity and improve consistency across responses. The second variable was academic stress, measured using a standardized academic stress scale that produces a total numeric score. Higher scores indicate greater perceived academic stress. The scale demonstrated strong internal consistency in the current sample, supporting reliability, and prior validation studies support its construct validity. The purpose of this correlational quantitative study was to examine the relationship between social media use and academic stress among college students. The research question guiding the study was, what is the relationship between average daily social media use and academic stress among college students? The null hypothesis stated that there is no statistically significant relationship between social media use and academic stress among college students. The alternative hypothesis stated that there is a statistically significant relationship between social media use and academic stress among college students. Data were collected through an online survey administered during the middle of the academic term. Each participant provided one estimate of average daily social media use and one academic stress score. This ensured paired observations. Cases with missing data on either variable were removed using listwise deletion, resulting in a final sample of 112 students. Before conducting the correlation analysis, the assumptions required for Pearson's correlation were evaluated carefully, because violations can distort both the magnitude and interpretation of the correlation coefficient. The first assumption is paired observations. This requires that each data point represent a matched pair of values from the same individual. In this study, each student contributed exactly one social media use score and one academic stress score. Because no student contributed more than one pair, this assumption was met. The second assumption is linearity. Linearity means that the relationship between the two variables should follow a roughly straight-line pattern rather than a curved one. This was evaluated by examining a scatterplot of social media use hours and academic stress scores. If the points had formed a curved pattern or shown no directional trend, Pearson's R would not be appropriate. Instead, the scatterplot showed a general upward trend, indicating that higher social media use tended to be associated with higher academic stress. This visual evidence supports the linearity assumption. The third assumption is the absence of extreme outliers. Outliers matter in correlation because a small number of extreme values can disproportionately influence the correlation coefficient. The scatterplot was examined for points far removed from the overall pattern. No extreme cases were identified that appeared to drive the relationship, supporting this assumption. The fourth assumption is approximate normality of the variables. This means that each variable should be reasonably symmetrically distributed without severe skew. Distributional checks indicated that both variables were approximately normally distributed. Pearson's R is robust to modest deviations from normality, so this level of distributional shape was considered acceptable. Because the assumptions of paired observations, linearity, absence of extreme outliers, and approximate normality were reasonably met, Pearson's correlation coefficient was selected as the appropriate analytic tool. The correlation analysis produced a Pearson correlation coefficient of R equals 32 with an associated p-value of 0.001. The correlation coefficient, R, conveys both direction and strength. The positive value indicates that higher values of one variable tend to be associated with higher values of the other variable. In this study, the positive value of 0.32 indicates that students who reported higher daily social media use also tended to report higher academic stress. The p-value is used to determine statistical significance. It represents the probability of observing a relationship of this size, or larger, if there were actually no relationship in the population. The decision rule used in this study was that p-values less than 0.05 indicate statistical significance. Because 0.001 is much smaller than 0.05, the null hypothesis was rejected. This provides statistical evidence that a relationship exists between social media use and academic stress in this sample. It is important to distinguish statistical significance from practical importance. Statistical significance answers the question of whether there is evidence of a relationship. Practical importance is addressed through effect size. Correlation itself functions as an effect size. An R value of 0.32 represents a small to moderate association. This indicates that the variables are related in a noticeable way, but not strongly. To further clarify practical meaning, shared variance was examined using R squared. Squaring the correlation coefficient yields R squared equals 10. Shared variance represents the proportion of variability that the two variables have in common. This means that approximately 10% of the variation in academic stress scores overlaps with variation in social media use. In practical terms, social media use is related to academic stress, but most of what explains stress differences among students lies outside social media use alone. A 95% confidence interval was calculated for the correlation coefficient, ranging from 14 to 48. A confidence interval provides a range of plausible values for the true population correlation. The 95% level indicates that if this study were repeated many times, approximately 95% of the calculated intervals would contain the true correlation value. Because the entire interval lies above zero, it reinforces the conclusion that the relationship is positive. The width of the interval also indicates that while the relationship is reliably positive, its true strength in the population may range from small to moderate. This range is important for decision-making because it signals uncertainty about the exact magnitude of the relationship. As a robustness check, a Spearman correlation was also examined and yielded a similar pattern of association, suggesting that the observed relationship was not driven by distributional assumptions alone. This supports trustworthiness of the findings. These results can be interpreted through the transactional model of stress and coping. The positive association is consistent with the framework's emphasis on appraisal and coping processes. Higher social media use may increase perceived demands or influence coping strategies in ways that heighten stress appraisal. At the same time, the modest effect size aligns with the framework's expectation that stress emerges from multiple interacting demands rather than a single behavior. Several limitations should be considered. The correlational design does not support causal conclusions. The direction of influence cannot be determined. Third variables such as academic workload, sleep, employment hours, or financial stress may influence both social media use and academic stress. Social media use was measured through self-report, which may introduce reporting error. The convenience sample limits generalizability. Despite these limitations, the findings have meaningful implications for policy and practice. The combination of statistical significance and modest effect size suggests that institutions should avoid simplistic conclusions that social media is the primary cause of academic stress. Overestimating its role could misdirect resources, while underestimating it could ignore a meaningful contributor. Evidence supports proportionate responses that integrate digital wellness education within broader efforts to address academic demands, advising support, and mental health services. Future research should build on these findings using longitudinal designs to examine directionality, inclusion of additional variables to clarify mechanisms, and exploration of whether specific patterns of social media use are more strongly related to academic stress than total hours alone. In summary, this correlational case study demonstrates how correlation can be used to examine the strength and direction of a relationship between two numeric variables. In this sample of college students, social media use and academic stress showed a statistically significant but modest positive association. The findings matter because they help calibrate institutional assumptions and support evidence-based, proportionate responses to student stress grounded in empirical data rather than assumption.